There are houses, so beautiful you're afraid to breathe too loudly. Nestled in a quiet forest on the outskirts of Connecticut, the mansion of Edward Grant, a 50-year-old businessman once featured on the cover of Forbes, resembles a miniature museum, flawless, luxurious, and utterly silent. The wrought iron gates stood taller than a man, ivy-covered walls were trimmed so precisely that no leaf was out of place. Inside, the white marble floors gleamed under chandeliers imported from Vienna. The chairs were upholstered in Italian leather. Hand-painted silk curtains framed every window. Every item in the house spoke the same unspoken language, "Do not touch me." There was no laughter, no voices, only the steady clock ticking like the heartbeat of a sterile world. Since the sudden death of his wife 6 years ago, Edward hadn't hosted a single party. No guests, no relatives, only routine and control things he understood far better than any emotion. People called him the cold man. They weren't wrong, but they weren't entirely correct either, because behind the coldness was a fracture like a crack in fine crystal glass, invisible until the moment it shattered. Naomi Harris was the least mentioned name among the staff who kept that grand house running. Not because she was incompetent. On the contrary, she folded linens like an origami artist, polished floors until the walnut wood reflected the eyes of those who walked by, brewed tea at precisely 72 degrees just as the late Mrs. Grant liked it. She was 22. Black, slender, quiet, she always wore a slightly oversized uniform as if trying to hide herself inside it. She didn't speak to anyone unless necessary. Never complained, not even on snowy days when the bus was late or her paycheck came a week behind. She nodded, bowed slightly, and went back to work. Naomi was called the ideal invisible. No trouble, no presence, no perfume. Edward Grant, with the precision of an investor who once bought out an entire corporation in 48 hours, never paid attention to the maid named Naomi. To him, she was just another part of the machinery, like the dining table that was always set on time, the white flowers that were replaced every 3 days, and the piano that was wiped down every Saturday evening. She existed but didn't occupy space. If Naomi disappeared one day, the house would continue running precisely the same way. And perhaps Naomi believed that too, until one night, one moment. Everything began to shift because of a sliver of light under the kitchen door at 2:15 a.m. A tiny light, but enough to reveal what had never been seen in a house too accustomed to darkness. That night, as usual, Edward Grant awoke at 2:15 a.m. No clear reason, no nightmare, just a dry throat that tugged him out of an already shallow sleep. The mansion was so quiet that he could hear his breathing. The night wind slipped through thick glass windows, causing the white curtains to stir gently like a spirit trying to find its way home. He wore his robe and walked barefoot through the corridor, long as a labyrinth. Each step on the marble floor produced a soft clack that echoed through a space where time seemed to have paused. Then, a thin light cut across the hallway floor like a thread slipping from beneath the kitchen door. No one was allowed to use the kitchen after 10 p.m. This was an unwritten rule laid down by Edward himself and followed by all without complaint. The staff had gone home long ago. The chef left at 7 p.m. Even the coffee machine was programmed to shut down at 10:30. So who was in there? A forgotten light, an intruder. Edward frowned, not in panic, not in alarm. He was far too used to controlling everything from financial markets to hallway lighting. He gently pushed the wooden door open. What he saw inside made him stop. right in the middle of the luxurious kitchen, lined with granite and stainless steel. Naomi Harris sat with her head bowed over a pile of thick books. She didn't hear him come in. Her curly hair was tied neatly back. A silver-grey sweater was draped over her uniform. A pencil was tucked behind her ear. On the table, biology textbooks, organic chemistry, human anatomy diagrams, and a steaming cup of tea. She was taking notes non-stop, her left hand supporting her forehead, lips murmuring as if memorizing life itself. No wary glances, no pretending. She was genuine. Edward didn't step inside. He stood silently at the doorway like a visitor who had wandered into a world that didn't belong to him. Until now, he had never imagined Naomi had another life. She was just the maid, nothing more, nothing less. But now before him was a young woman fighting silently each page of those books, a rung on a ladder she was climbing when no one was looking. She was studying not for fun, but for survival, for something far bigger than herself. He cleared his throat, just a soft sound, but enough to startle her. Naomi looked up, eyes wide with fear, panic and embarrassment. Her teacup nearly slipped from her hands. She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching against the tile floor. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't think anyone. She fumbled, adjusting her sweater eyes cast down. Edward raised his hand, a small but heavy gesture. It's all right, he said slowly. I just came down for some water. Naomi nodded rapidly. Yes, of course. I'll clean this up right away. No need. His voice was calm, steady. Then after a breath, what are you studying? A question that seemed simple, but no one had ever asked her. Naomi looked up, her brown eyes are deep and clear in the light. Preparing for the online pre-med program, sir. Her answer came quietly, but firmly. She didn't need to say more. The worn pages, frayed corners, highlighted text, and hand-colored anatomy diagrams spoke for her. Edward glanced at the book. A sketch of a kidney outlined in black ink came into view, shaky but accurate. You want to be a nurse? He asked. Naomi looked up. In her eyes now no more fear, only fire. I want to be a doctor. The answer was direct, not a moment's hesitation. Edward said nothing more. He nodded slightly, placed his glass of water on the counter, and turned to leave. But when he reached the hallway, he stopped. The light beneath the kitchen door still glowed like a lifeline in a house far too used to darkness. And for the first time in many years, Edward Grant did not return to bed. He stood by the window for a long time, watching the trees sway in the night, and felt something shift inside his chest. The next morning, the mansion was as quiet as ever. The white lilies had been replaced and were set perfectly beside the fireplace buffet. The financial paper lay neatly next to a steaming cup of coffee, its front page turned just the way the longtime butler had always prepared it. Everything was perfect. But Edward didn't read the paper. His hand rested lightly on the armrest. His eyes were fixed on a half-open window. And in his mind was the image of a black girl sitting in the kitchen light the night before with a pencil behind her ear and eyes that begged for nothing, explained nothing, holding only one quiet goal: to become a doctor. I want to be a doctor. Those 4 words weren't just a declaration. They were like a tiny arrow lodged in his softest part, one that had long turned to stone. Edward didn't know why he kept thinking about her. Not out of pity, not out of curiosity, but because of that look in her eyes. He had once had it too. He used to have that look standing before his very first boardroom when no one knew the name Edward Grant, when he still had to borrow a suit for investor meetings. But he had forgotten. Naomi, on the other hand, was still holding on to steadfastly even when the whole world looked away. That afternoon, Edward called his private butler, Mr. Denham, into his study. "She's been working here how long now?" 3 years and 2 months, Sir Denham replied, as if he'd waited all his life for that question, but never thought it would be asked. "No family here, no sir. Her family's in Louisiana. She sends nearly her entire paycheck home every month. I believe her mother has a chronic illness and she's supporting 2 younger siblings in school. She ever asked for anything?" "Never, sir. Never taken leave and never complained. Works with extreme precision. Sometimes we forget she's even here." That last line made Edward pause. "We forget she's even here." Was that a compliment? Or a confession, the power of silent presence and the subtle shift of perspective? That night, precisely at 2:15 a.m., he stood again at the top of the stairs. Not because he was thirsty, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he wanted to know if she was there. The kitchen door was still lit. The sound of pages turning, the faint scratch of a pencil, the gentle breathing in silence. Naomi was still sitting there, as if the world had never disheartened her. But this time he didn't enter. He just stood outside the door, listening to her murmuring a passage in Latin, her southern accent still faint but every syllable filled with effort. And in that quiet kitchen, he felt like a stranger in his house, a 50-year-old man who had everything except a reason to wake up each morning. The phone call, and a prayer no one heard. 3 nights later, he passed by the back hallway and heard Naomi on the phone. She didn't know someone was near. The door was only slightly ajar. Her voice was small, trembling, and full of fatigue. "No, I haven't told anyone, Mari. I can't lose this job. If I fail the test, then all those sleepless nights, what would they even mean? I'm trying. I need you to pray for me, because I don't have much time left." Edward stood still. It was as if he had just stepped into the holiest place within a person the moment they confess fear, not out of weakness, but because they love what they're protecting too much. A quiet search and an unnamed decision. That night, Edward opened his laptop. For the first time in years, he typed into the search bar, "Online Pre-Med Scholarship Program." It took less than 10 minutes. He found the website, a prestigious program. Tuition just high enough to sever all hope for someone doing manual labor. No scholarships, no discounts, only demands and challenges. He sat frozen before the screen. His hands didn't tremble, but his heart did. Naomi never asked for help. She had never once said, "I need you." But somehow, she had reminded him what it felt like to want to do the right thing, not because it was grand, but because it was the last thing left that made a person true to themselves. The letter arrived on a grey Tuesday morning. A light rain was falling. Mist covered the stone-paved yard. No bird sang. The house was unusually still, as if waiting for something to change. Naomi Harris found the envelope in the rag drawer near the laundry room where staff usually received paychecks or notes from management. Her name was printed in bold black ink, on the envelope spelled perfectly, not a letter missing. Above it is the seal, "Years of the New York State Pre-Medical Program," the institution where she submitted her application. Just one line, and the world seemed to pause. Naomi stepped into her room, the tiny space she had lived in for 3 years, barely enough for a single bed, an old wardrobe and a bookshelf sagging under the weight. She gently closed the door, took off her shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed, as if a single strong movement might shatter the moment. Her fingers trembled as she peeled the envelope open. The paper inside was thin, and the print was neat and formal, just like every administrative letter. But one line was enough. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the pre-medical program with a full scholarship sponsored by an anonymous donor." Naomi read it a second time, then a third. No tears fell, but her heart cracked into pieces. Not from joy, but from sheer disbelief. She had done it. Through silent nights of studying, with second-hand books borrowed from the public library, through the belief no one held but herself. But then, the elation lasted just a breath. Immediately the familiar worry returned. One opportunity, but at the cost of everything else. Online study wasn't playtime. She would have assignments, virtual labs, reports, exams, and professional seminars. She spends time mopping floors, folding laundry, and ironing clothes for others. Could she quit her job? No. Her mother needed monthly medication. Mari and Ben needed tuition. The rent back home was never paid on time. The scholarship got her into school, but didn't preserve everything she was barely holding up. Naomi folded the letter, placed it in her drawer, and then did something she had never done after receiving good news. She went outside and mopped the floors like a machine. Not because she wasn't happy, but because she didn't have the right to let go of reality. The master noticed the change even if no one said a word. That afternoon, Edward Grant noticed Naomi didn't smile as usual when taking the fresh towels from the cart. Her hands moved more slowly, her eyes are slightly dull. Something inside her had taken a step back. The kitchen door was still lit, the sound of pages turning, the scratch of a pencil, the soft breathing in the silence. Naomi was still there, as if the world had never worn her down. But this time, he didn't enter. He stood outside, listening to her mumble a line of Latin. Her southern accent is still evident, but full of effort. And in that silent kitchen, he felt like a stranger in his home, a 50-year-old man who had everything, except a reason to wake up each morning, the phone call, and the prayer no one heard. 3 nights later, he passed the back hallway and heard Naomi on the phone. She didn't know someone was nearby. The door was just slightly ajar. Her voice was soft, shaky, and weary. "I wish I could accept it, but if I quit my job, Mom doesn't get her meds. Murray can't go to school. I can't just think about myself." Her voice choked. No one comforted her, no soundtrack played. Just a 22-year-old girl trying to hold together both ends of a dream stretched thin by duty. The helplessness of a man who once bought a company in 3 days. Edward sat in his office late into the night. On the desk lay legal documents from his lawyer, the Grace Fund scholarship finalized. Everything he'd done, the funding, the anonymity, the secrecy. He thought that was enough, but now he understood. Not everyone can reach the doorway of their dreams just because they're given the key. Some need a hand to help pull them through, not because they're weak, but because they've spent so long carrying others. Words Naomi had never heard in her life. The next morning, Naomi knocked on Edward's office door for the first time in 3 years. She held the scholarship envelope. She stepped in, stood upright, looked sideways, and spoke softly. "I know the scholarship is from you." Edward didn't deny it. He nodded. She continued, "I'm grateful, truly grateful, but I don't think I can accept it. I can't quit my job, my family." He interrupted gently but firmly, "Naomi, if you sacrifice your dream just to survive, you'll survive your whole life, but you'll never truly live." The room fell silent. Naomi's eyes welled up, not from weakness, but because for the first time someone told her she was worthy of dreaming. Naomi left the Grant mansion on a quiet morning before the sun had burned through the soft mist on the gravel road leading to the main gate. She didn't carry much. Just a faded cloth bag, simple outfits, a notebook filled with scribbles, and a family photo carefully tucked inside an old biology textbook. No tears, no farewells, just the familiar creak of the iron gate and her steady steps, not trembling but resolute, as if each step carried a promise she would return, but not in her old role. The small dorm room supported by the school wasn't anything special. Pale painted walls, an old window, a wobbly desk, and a single bed with a wrinkled white sheet. But to Naomi, it was the first space she could call her own. After years of living in others' kitchens, walking through polished hallways like a shadow. The noise wasn't vacuum cleaners or leather shoes on marble floors, but the scratch of pens, Zoom lectures, and soft memory tunes from cheap headphones. She began her pre-med program like someone entering a battlefield. No armor, no protection, just determination as her weapon. She studied as if time could slip away. She took notes line by line, drew internal organs with crayons, read until her eyes blurred, and did exams with trembling hands from weeks without proper sleep. She didn't speak much to her classmates. Around her were students from elite high schools, toting shiny MacBooks, engraved water bottles, and confidence built from a childhood without lack. Naomi was different. She brought only willpower, something unseen but always present in her every move. How she arrived earlier than everyone, stayed behind to note down supplemental materials, did more than her share in group work without a single complaint. And then, one day, someone noticed. The professor presented a complex clinical case in an immunology class, asking students to diagnose vague symptoms. The room fell silent. Glances exchanged books, flipped confused eyes everywhere. Then Naomi, in a calm, steady voice, said, "This is indicative of hyper-IgE syndrome. We're looking at a textbook case of Job's syndrome." The room froze. The professor smiled and nodded. She wasn't just correct. She was the only one who figured it out, thanks to a section he'd once said was optional reading. The next question was no longer, "Who is she?" but "How did she know?" Someone asked her name, not to assign chores for the first time, out of genuine curiosity. And right then, when she began to feel like she truly belonged, a handwritten letter appeared in her student mailbox. No return address, no congratulations, just a few neat lines in blue ink. "I see you. Thank you for not giving up." Naomi didn't need to ask who sent it. She knew, not by the handwriting, but because the only person who had truly seen her in the most profound sense was the man standing behind the kitchen door that night. From then on, letters arrived regularly, without greeting or signature. Just folded slips of paper, sometimes with small notes about a new grant, opening a shipment of medical books, arriving at the library, or simply a short line, "When you're tired, remember why you started." Naomi never replied. She didn't need to. Their connection wasn't built on dialogue, but on steady presence, like a hand behind your back when you can't go on, not pushing, just steady enough to keep you from falling. Back at the mansion, Edward hung Naomi's letters on his office wall. Not to boast, not for anyone to see, but as a reminder to himself. He once lived in a house without sound, and now each line was like the first gust of wind reviving a frozen soul. He didn't hope she'd know. He didn't need thanks. He needed only one thing: she kept going, and never forgot why she started. Naomi began to change, not in ways everyone could see, like grades or praise, but in how she entered class each morning, her head slightly higher, eyes no longer avoiding contact, and her gait no longer one of someone trying to shrink into the background. She didn't try to stand out, but her consistency, quiet commitment, and faith in her every move made it impossible not to notice. One professor wrote at the end of an essay, "You have the precision of a doctor and the silence of someone who's endured more than she says." Naomi didn't know how to respond except with a small smile, the kind she had long forgotten to give herself. She still sent money home regularly, still took extra jobs at the library, tutored first-year students, and sold used books to save every penny. But the difference lay in how she did all those things, no longer burdened, no longer like she was struggling to stay afloat. It was as if she had stepped into a new state where faith was no longer something she had to protect, but something that lifted her day by day. She never mentioned the one who helped her begin this journey, but each time a new letter arrived, a scholarship was renewed, or a medical textbook appeared unexpectedly in her dorm bin, she smiled not from surprise but from knowing someone was still watching, in silence. At the Grant estate, everything remained in its place. The flowers were still replaced every 3 days. The dining table was still covered with a white cloth pressed to a crisp. But one thing no one in the house could explain: the master's gaze seemed to have changed. Edward no longer merely walked past people. He began to pause, to listen, to observe. And sometimes I asked questions unrelated to work. When a new staff member arrived from the south, he asked if she missed the taste of gumbo. When the driver had back pain, he summoned a doctor. No one understood what was happening, but they sensed a shift, subtle, quiet, and making them feel seen. Edward began to read more, not reports, but books about public health systems, class-based disparities in medicine, and the dreams of students like Naomi, those who never had straight roads, only detours. He wasn't searching for answers. He was learning to understand a world he had never thought about before. He no longer attended board meetings as often. He declined an interview with a major magazine. And one autumn afternoon, he approved an anonymous donation to a program supporting students without family, something he had once dismissed as non-viable investments. Naomi didn't know any of this, but she felt it in every shipment of medicine that arrived just in time at the dorm clinic, felt it when her laptop broke and a new one was sent with a handwritten note for tougher questions and longer nights. She never said thank you, but every letter she wrote about small victories each time she described a class, a mock patient, a correct diagnosis, was the most profound gratitude wrapped in every slanted word, and the familiar closing line, "I haven't forgotten what brought me here." And on the other side, in a wood-paneled office, lined with nameless letters, Edward read those lines not to feel right, but to remind himself that life, however quiet, always leaves room for something miraculous. He didn't need Naomi to return. He wasn't waiting for her to name him, because he understood that when you help someone enough to let them keep walking, the most significant presence is no longer needed to be present. That afternoon, Naomi received a thicker-than-usual white envelope in her student mailbox. No postmark, no introduction line, just a bold title at the top of the page, Outstanding Academic Achievement Award. Fall semester. She read it twice, then a third time, and though she could not show emotion easily, her lips curled into an undeniable smile. She hadn't known she was nominated. I didn't know which professor had submitted the internal review to the board. However, the letter accompanying the certificate said, clearly, Naomi Harris is not only a top-performing student, but a model of resilience, integrity, and humility in academic life. The award ceremony took place that weekend in a small school auditorium, with soft yellow lighting, neatly arranged rows of chairs, and a bare-bones stage. Naomi sat in the last row, fingers gently gripping the invitation card, eyes fixed on the front wall as if trying to avoid the feeling of belonging. The announcer had to call her name twice, and the applause began to ripple. She walked onto the stage in scuffed leather shoes, polished to a shine, a crisp white shirt she'd ironed by a hand the night before, and an expression that had never imagined being called in front of a crowd. No one knew the road she had walked to reach that moment. No one knew she once scrubbed mansion floors while others learned to speak on stages. But the light that fell on her face that day wasn't given. It was earned by walking out of the dark on her own 2 feet. A week later, Naomi was selected as a mentor in the student advisory program, where third years like her would help international first-year students get used to schoolwork, campus life, and the feeling of not belonging. She accepted not for credit or recognition, but for something more profound, a wish to be the first to tell someone they could do it. Just like a voice once pulled her back from life's sharpest curve, if you sacrifice your dream just to survive, you'll survive forever, but never truly live. She was assigned to mentor a student from Haiti. His name was Ely Small, in stature, soft-spoken, with eyes always lowered when entering class. Naomi didn't pry. She showed him around campus, taught him how to use the library, guided him through online research, and sometimes gently reminded him, "You don't have to be fast, just don't stop." One day, Ely left a small note in her desk drawer. "Thank you for seeing me. Not just as a student, but as a person." Naomi read the line, folded it, and placed it in her notebook, between anatomy notes, not to keep a memory, but to remind herself that she was walking the right path. At the mansion, Edward kept reading Naomi's letters every afternoon. The letter she wrote about standing on stage made him set his coffee down and sit still for a long time. She didn't elaborate on her feelings, just wrote briefly, "That day they called my name. I'm not used to stepping in front of people. But I thought of those 2 a.m. nights in the kitchen when I stood there, and I didn't tremble." He read that line 3 times. Then he pulled out an old wooden frame and placed inside a printout of the academic certificate he'd asked someone to photograph from the university website, not to show off, but to hang in his study among the growing number of handwritten letters on the wall. The room was no longer where he drafted business strategies. It had become a sanctuary of proof that silence does not equal invisibility. He started contributing more to the scholarship fund for Naomi and the mentoring program she had joined. All anonymously. There was no golden plaque with his name, but every time the fund expanded, whenever another international student received free textbooks, or a new financial aid package appeared in the student system, Naomi understood. He was still there, saying nothing, yet ever present. As the new semester began, Naomi was placed in one of the first groups to experience clinical practice at a frontline hospital where she would work alongside doctors, observe real patients, and learn to make decisions under pressure. On her first morning, she stood in the long hallway of the pediatrics department, clipboard in hand, wearing a crisp white lab coat with her name neatly embroidered on the left chest. She felt small, but not weak. It wasn't fear like stepping through a doorway she had stood before all her life and was only now allowed to pass through. The first case was a 7-year-old girl hospitalized for a persistent cough. Her mother arrived tense, and the girl trembled, clutching a one-eared stuffed toy. Naomi didn't say much. She knelt to the child's eye level, removed her lab coat and name badge. A young woman smiling gently said, "I used to be scared of hospitals too, but I know a way to make them a little less scary. Want to try?" And somehow, just minutes later, the little girl was telling stories about her grandma's cat and a time she fell off her bike, while Naomi listened and simultaneously jotted down clinical signs so deftly that no one even noticed. She hadn't learned that skill from books. No one had taught her how to talk to a patient using the voice of someone who had known fear. But she understood because she had once been the person who couldn't say what she needed simply because she thought no one would listen. And now, standing among white beds and steady beeping heart monitors, Naomi was not just a medical student. She was someone who made patients feel a little less afraid. Sometimes that alone is healing. She began writing down small stories from each shift, not to boast, but as a way of documenting her journey. She still sent handwritten letters regularly. From her cramped apartment, she wrote about the boy with an autoimmune disorder, the elderly woman with no family who was still hanging on, and the stern supervising doctor who unexpectedly placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You don't just understand patients, you make them believe." She never added words of thanks in her letters, but as Edward read them, each line quieted him further. Every word Naomi wrote was more than a report of academic progress. It was living proof of something he had once doubted, that someone, when truly believed in, can go far beyond themselves. He began stepping back from his board duties, not out of fatigue, but he started seeing life outside the office, where quiet people were making change one step at a time, as the place most worth investing in. One day, a letter arrived with a copy of a new certificate. Naomi had officially been chosen as the lead student for the hospital's spring clinical rotation. In the letter she wrote, "One of my patients looked at me and said, 'I didn't know doctors could be women.' I smiled and said, 'Now you do.'" Edward folded the letter, leaned on his desk, and stared out the window. He didn't cry, but something cracked open in his chest, not from pain, but because something long frozen was melting. In the hospital hallways, Naomi continued moving from room to room, greeting patients by name, bending when needed, touching their hands not just as a clinical gesture, but as a silent promise, "I'm here and I see you." In a world where patients are often file numbers and symptoms mere lines of data, Naomi had become something different. Not a doctor of authority, but a woman of heart. The car pulled up in front of the grand iron gates of the Grant estate on a spring afternoon. Sunlight dusted the gravel path, the breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs, and the air felt familiar and entirely new, as if memories were being reawakened, with eyes that had changed. Naomi stepped out of the car with steady feet. A light grey blazer covered her white coat. Her hair was tied neatly behind her head, and in her hand was a slim folder, not someone else's, but her own. Dr. Naomi Harris, the name was engraved on the metal badge pinned to her chest. There was nothing to prove, no need to bow. She rang the bell. The familiar chime echoed like a voice from a distant past. The door opened, and Edward Grant, now with greyer hair and deeper crow's feet, stood there, not as a master of the house, but like someone who had waited too long to know what to say. They looked at each other, a long, wordless moment of understanding. Then she smiled gently. "Hello, sir. I mean, hello, Edward." He chuckled softly, eyes glinting with something between surprise and pride. "Come in." The house looked the same, everything seemingly untouched: polished wood floors, soft white curtains, the vase of lilies on the living room table. But the space felt different. No longer cold, no longer a place where people came to be silent, but a home one returned to, silenced by something too vast for words. They sat in the sunroom overlooking the garden. Light filtered through layers of leaves, casting shadows on the old tiled floor, and in that silence Edward spoke first. "I kept every letter you sent." Naomi turned, surprised. "I didn't know." He nodded slowly. "I didn't need a reply. Just needed to know you were still going." Then gently he pointed to a framed picture hanging on the bookshelf. Inside was an old certificate, Naomi's first academic award at university, alongside the handwritten line she once wrote. "I didn't tremble." Naomi looked at the framed certificate for a long moment. She didn't speak. Then she placed the folder between them on the wooden table. "I came to say this before anyone else. I'm opening a clinic in Queens. Not big, just 5 rooms and a waiting bench. for those with no one to stand when they're in pain. Edward went silent. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't ask if she needed funding. He said one sentence in a voice as soft as breath. The world just became a little better. Naomi smiled, a smile not of someone who once scrubbed floors, but of a woman who knows exactly who she is. She stood up unhurried, and when she reached the door, she turned to look at him, eyes quietly saying, "Thank you for seeing me, even before I could see myself." But she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she nodded slightly and walked away, as if silence had always been the language they agreed on. After Naomi left, Edward returned to his study. He opened an old drawer, pulled out the first letter she had ever sent, and placed it next to the clinic folder she had just delivered. The last light of the day slipped across the pages, glinting off the wall where dozens of unsigned letters had been pinned. And he knew with crystal clarity he had never felt life was more meaningful, not because of what he had owned, but because of what he had given without needing anyone to know. The Humana clinic didn't have a flashy facade. It sat modestly in the middle of a small Queen Street, wedged between a closed laundromat and an old corner store with a rusty awning. Its brick face was faded red-white paint, unevenly brushed on the window frames, and a hand-painted sign hung by wire read, "Everyone is welcome." No questions asked, no explanations were needed. People didn't come because of ads or referrals. They came because they believed this was a place where no one would first ask, "Do you have insurance?" but instead, "Where does it hurt?" Naomi didn't launch the clinic with a big event or invite the media. On the first day, she stood behind a scratched wooden counter in her white coat hair, neatly tied clipboard in hand, with a calm, grounded smile. The first patient was a young mother with 2 coughing children. The second was an older man with a hunched back who barely walked. The third was a teenage girl of Chinese descent who had a torn hand but was too afraid to visit a hospital because she had no papers. Naomi didn't ask many questions. She just looked them in the eyes and nodded. Then she began doing what she had prepared for through all those years she cared. The day passed. Each person who left carried more than just a prescription. They carried away a little weight lifted from their soul. Naomi didn't pretend to be strong, but every time she washed her hands, straightened her coat, and walked to the following exam table, she radiated a quiet steadiness that made others feel safe. That evening, she sat down to file charts, count medicines, and sort the new batch of vaccines that had just arrived. From an anonymous foundation, no sender address, no note attached. But she knew exactly who was behind it. And just at sunset, as the sun shone through the glass window and lit up a child's painting on the wall, a crayon drawing of children holding hands under a tree, the clinic door opened. No name was called, no warning, but when Naomi looked up, she saw him. Edward Grant, the man she had never called father or mentor, but who had lit a fire in her life silently through unwavering belief. He wasn't in a suit, just a long, simple coat looking slightly thinner than before. But his eyes still shone, not the sharp glint of a businessman, but the gentle gaze of someone who had seen a seed grow and had cherished every leaf. Naomi didn't stand. She gestured to the small bench outside. The sun angled just right, and the breeze carried the sound of children playing nearby. He sat beside her, no words. They sat like that for many minutes. No stories needed, no memories recalled. Everything had already been written in actions. And now all they needed was to be simple. After a while he spoke softly. "I used to think the world changed through grand speeches." Naomi tilted her head, smiled, and then you realized. "It starts with a kitchen light at 2 a.m. They both chuckled, but it was true. Then he turned, took her hand, not tightly, not weakly, just firmly enough to say, "I never stopped believing in you." When Edward stood to leave, he gave no advice and made no promises. He said only one thing: keep the light on, and Naomi, with a promise long anchored in her heart, replied, "I always do." That night after locking up, Naomi found a small slip of paper wedged under the mailbox. No envelope, no signature, just one sentence. "You created something beautiful. Thank you for showing me that kindness is never wasted." She folded the note and placed it inside her medical notebook in the cabinet. That cabinet held everything that mattered: her diploma, medical license, family photo, and all the things that reminded her of the path she had taken. On the wall, there was only one framed image: an old blurry phone photo of Naomi, still just a girl in a grey sweater, sitting in the Grant Mansion's kitchen, head bent over her book's pen behind her ear, warm light falling over a quiet but determined face. No one took her picture that night, but someone had kept it, and now she had framed it herself as a reminder. Not everyone starts in the light, but everyone deserves to have a light of their own. Some people change the world with fame. Others change it with a kitchen light at 2 a.m., a quiet belief, and a silent act that no one ever needed to know about. Naomi Harris didn't start from a fair line. She started from silence, from rooms where people walked past without ever seeing her. But it was there she lit her first flame, and then lit it for others. Because sometimes you don't need someone shouting that you have worth. You need one person quietly saying, "I see you, and you deserve to go on." If you're fighting alone, don't forget light doesn't have to be big to fill the room. It just has to be honest and persistent. Share this video if you believe kindness is never wasted, and the quietest dreams are the ones most worth fulfilling. Subscribe to Touching Story so you won't miss the following story that moves your heart. And remember to keep the light on for yourself, because one day you might be the reason someone doesn't give up.